My dog stopped dead at the creek bank. When animals that have seen flood and bullfights won't cross water, you know you've got trouble. I squinted through the heat shimmer rising from red dirt that had been bone dry for 18 months. Yet there it was, a pool of water that caught the late afternoon sun and threw it back in impossible colors. Not the muddy brown of normal creek water, but ribbons of green and blue and gold that moved like oil on the surface. "Come on, girls," I called to my blue heelers, but Sheila and Dot refused to budge. Their hackles were raised, ears flat against their skulls as they stared at the water, with the kind of fear I'd only seen when dingoes were about. These dogs had crossed flooded rivers and faced down wild bulls without hesitation, yet they wouldn't take another step toward what should have been a blessing after the worst drought in living memory. I dismounted the quad bike and approached the pool on foot. The water was crystal clear beneath that strange prismatic surface, revealing smooth river stones that definitely hadn't been there yesterday, when I'd ridden this same track checking fence lines. I knelt and cupped some in my palm. It felt normal enough, cool and clean, but the rainbow effect intensified as it ran between my fingers. The liquid caught the light and scattered it back in patterns that hurt to look at directly, like staring at a broken prism. The dogs whimpered behind me, and when I turned to coax them forward, I noticed they weren't just afraid of the water. Their eyes kept darting to something beyond it, up toward the rocky outcrop that bordered this section of my property. I'd explored every inch of my station over the past 15 years, but the afternoon light was hitting the sandstone cliff face at an angle that revealed something new, or perhaps something very old. Dark lines scored the rock surface in deliberate patterns, not natural weathering or mineral stains, but purposeful marks that formed shapes and figures. I left the quad bike and scrambled up the loose scree slope, my worn boots sliding on stones that scattered down behind me with sharp clicks and rattles. The closer I got, the clearer the images became, serpentine forms undulating across the rock, surrounded by symbols I couldn't interpret, but which stirred something ancestral in my chest. One figure dominated the others, a massive serpent painted in ochre and white, its body stretching across 20 feet of stone. Its head pointed directly toward the pool below, as if indicating something of vital importance. I'd seen Aboriginal rock art before on my rare trips to Alice Springs, but this was different. These paintings seemed to pulse with significance, and the longer I stared at them, the more convinced I became that they were connected to the impossible water appearing on my land. The ochre paint looked fresh despite the obvious age of the artwork, as if the colors had been renewed by some process I couldn't understand. I reached out to touch one of the painted lines, then pulled my hand back, suddenly certain that contact would trigger something I wasn't prepared for. The silence up on the ridge was complete. No insect buzz, no bird calls, just the weight of attention from something vast and patient. By the time I rode back to the homestead, the sun was painting the western sky the same colors that had danced on the water's surface. My cattle station sprawled across 50,000 hectares of red dirt and scrub grass, a legacy from my grandfather who'd claimed this piece of the Northern Territory, back when the government was practically giving land away to anyone foolish enough to try farming it. The nearest neighbor was 60 kilometers east, the closest town, if you could call Willowborough's population of 230 people a town, was 200 kilometers south, along a dirt track that became impassable in the wet season. Most years, the isolation suited me fine. I'd inherited my grandfather's independence along with the land, preferring the company of my dogs and cattle to the complications that came with other people. But as I pulled up to my weathered homestead, 4 rooms, a wide veranda, and a corrugated iron roof that sang in the wind, I found myself wishing for someone to talk through what I'd seen today. The cattle were another problem entirely. My herd of 800 head had been clustered around the bore pumps for months, competing for every drop as the underground water table dropped lower and lower. Tonight, they were scattered across the paddocks, lowing restlessly and moving in agitated circles. Even from a distance, I could see they'd abandoned the bore troughs, leaving them half full, while the animals wandered aimlessly in the growing dark. Their usual evening routine, slow movement toward water, methodical drinking, then settling into nighttime positions, had been replaced by nervous pacing and occasional sharp calls that spoke of distress rather than contentment. Inside the homestead, I spread my grandfather's hand-drawn property maps across the kitchen table, trying to locate the exact position of the rock paintings and the new water source. The maps dated back to the 1950s and included features that no longer existed: creek beds that had been dry for decades, hills that had been quarried away, Aboriginal camps that were marked with simple X's and no other notation. The paper was yellowed and soft from handling, marked with my grandfather's careful pencil notations about bore depths, fence line repairs, and seasonal cattle movements. 1X was positioned exactly where I'd found the paintings today. Next to it my grandfather had written a single word in fading pencil: warned. The letters were barely visible, traced over multiple times as if he'd debated whether to leave any record at all. I stared at that word as I heated a tin of beans on my gas burner, the familiar domestic routine failing to calm my racing thoughts. Warned about what? And by whom? My grandfather had been a practical man who'd worked this land for 40 years without ever mentioning Aboriginal paintings or mysterious water sources. But then again, we'd never experienced a drought like this one, never pushed the land so hard that the cattle were eating bark off the trees and the bore pumps were sucking up sand. The radio crackled from the living room, my only connection to the outside world when the satellite phone wasn't working. The evening weather report promised more of the same: clear skies, temperatures pushing 40 degrees, no chance of rain. I turned it off and stepped onto the veranda, listening to the night sounds of my property. Something was different. The usual chorus of insects seemed muted, and my cattle were still moving restlessly in the darkness. Their shapes were visible as darker patches against the starlit paddocks, but instead of the usual settled clusters, they formed loose, nervous groups that shifted and reformed every few minutes. Even my dogs were behaving strangely, staying close to my legs instead of ranging freely around the yard as they normally did after a day's work. I pulled a beer from my ancient refrigerator and settled into my grandfather's chair, trying to make sense of the day's events. In 15 years of working this land, I'd never seen anything I couldn't explain with drought, weather patterns, or animal behavior. I was a practical man dealing with practical problems: falling cattle prices, rising feed costs, bore pumps that needed constant maintenance, and a bank manager in Darwin who called more often than my own sister. But as I sat in the darkness, sipping warm beer and listening to my agitated cattle, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted on my property today. The rainbow water, the ancient paintings, my dogs, fear, the cattle's strange behavior, it all felt connected in a way that my rational mind rejected, but my gut insisted was real. The beer tasted metallic in the dry air, and every small sound seemed amplified: the creak of the roof cooling, the distant lowing of unsettled cattle, the whisper of wind through grass that crackled with drought stress. Tomorrow I'd need to investigate further, maybe take some photos of the paintings and the water to show around town. Someone would have an explanation, probably something simple involving mineral deposits or underground springs. But tonight, surrounded by the vast emptiness of the Outback and the strange energy radiating from my land, I found myself staring at that single word on my grandfather's map and wondering what exactly my family had been warned about all those years ago. The stars wheeled overhead in their familiar patterns, but even they seemed different tonight, brighter somehow, more purposeful, as if they too were part of whatever was awakening in the red heart of my ancestral holding. I was checking the fence line near the anomalous creek the next morning when I spotted the dust cloud on the horizon. A battered Toyota Ute emerged from the heat shimmer, bouncing along the rough track that served as my property's main access road. The vehicle handled the corrugations and potholes with the steady rhythm of someone who knew this country intimately, not fighting the rough surface but working with it. I squinted against the sun, recognizing the distinctive way the driver managed the steering wheel, smooth corrections that kept the Ute tracking true despite the washouts and loose gravel. The dust plume followed at exactly the right distance, indicating proper speed for these conditions. The Ute pulled up beside my own vehicle, and an elderly Aboriginal man stepped out with the easy grace of someone who'd spent a lifetime working cattle. I recognized him immediately: Tommy Bradshaw, though I suspected that wasn't his traditional name. Tommy had worked stations across the territory for decades, one of the best stockmen I'd ever seen, with an almost supernatural ability to read cattle and country. We'd worked together briefly 3 seasons ago on a neighboring property during mustering, and I remembered being impressed by the old man's quiet competence. "Morning, Jake," Tommy said, his weathered face serious. His usual easy smile was absent, replaced by an expression I couldn't quite read. "Heard you might be having some unusual water problems." I raised an eyebrow, genuinely surprised by how quickly word had traveled. "News travels fast out here. Don't suppose you're looking for work? Could use an experienced hand." Even as I said it, I knew work wasn't what had brought him across 200 kilometers of rough country. Tommy shook his head, his dark eyes scanning the landscape with the intensity of someone reading an important message. He moved with the particular alertness I'd seen in stockmen checking for signs of trouble, head tilted slightly, attention focused on details most people would miss. Not work that brought me. My cousin Mary works at the general store in Catherine. She mentioned you were asking questions yesterday about rainbow water and rock paintings. He paused, studying my face with the careful assessment of someone trying to gauge another person's readiness for difficult information. Mind if I take a look at what you found? Something in Tommy's tone made me abandon my planned fence repairs immediately. The wire I'd been preparing to splice could wait. This felt more urgent than maintenance that had been deferred for months already. 20 minutes later, we stood together beside the impossible creek, watching rainbow-colored water flow steadily through what had been bone-dry sand just 2 days earlier. Tommy knelt beside the water, not touching it but holding his weathered hand just above the surface. His palm moved in small circles, as if feeling for something I couldn't detect. His expression grew increasingly troubled, the lines around his eyes deepening with concentration. "How long since this started?" Tommy asked quietly, his voice carrying a gravity that made my throat tighten. "Day before yesterday. My dogs wouldn't cross here, and then I found those paintings up on the ridge." I gestured toward the rock outcropping, noting how Tommy's gaze followed my pointing finger with immediate recognition. "Tommy, I've worked this land for 15 years. There's never been water here, not even in good seasons." Tommy stood slowly, his knees creaking with the sound of joints that had endured decades of hard physical work. He brushed dust from his palms with deliberate movements, his attention still focused on the flowing water. "Mind if I see those paintings?" We climbed the ridge in silence, Tommy moving with surprising agility despite his age. His boots found secure footing on loose stone that would have challenged men half his years. When we reached the rock shelter, he stood motionless for several minutes, studying the serpentine figures with an intensity that bordered on reverence. I watched Tommy's face, noting how his casual demeanor had been replaced by something approaching ceremonial seriousness. His breathing had changed, becoming deeper and more measured. His hands hung at his sides with the stillness of someone participating in something sacred. "These are old," Tommy finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Older than old. This is Rainbow Serpent country, Jake. Has been for thousands of years." Rainbow Serpent? The words felt strange in my mouth, carrying implications I wasn't prepared to understand. Tommy settled cross-legged on a flat rock, gesturing for me to sit. The stone was warm from the morning sun but somehow comforting, solid in a way that contrasted with the impossible water flowing below us. In the dreamtime, the great serpent moved across the land, carving rivers and gorges, creating waterholes, shaping the country. Where the serpent rested, water would flow. Where it moved, the land would change. He pointed at the paintings with a finger that traced the painted lines without quite touching them. "These mark one of its resting places." I felt a chill despite the climbing heat, goosebumps rising on my arms in the morning warmth. "Tommy, these are Aboriginal legends, right? Stories?" The old man's eyes were kind but firm, holding my gaze with patient certainty. "To your people, maybe. To mine, the dreamtime isn't past tense. It's always happening, always now. The serpent doesn't just live in stories, Jake, it lives in the land." He nodded toward the creek below, where sunlight caught the water and threw back those impossible colors. "And sometimes, when the land is stressed enough, when the balance is disturbed enough, the old powers wake up." "You're saying that water down there is because of some ancient serpent?" My voice sounded harsh in the quiet air, too loud for the reverent atmosphere that had settled around us. "I'm saying the land has memory, and when that memory is disturbed, things happen that don't fit in your practical world." Tommy's voice carried no judgment, just patient explanation tinged with the weariness of someone who'd had this conversation before. "My grandfather told me about this place, and his grandfather told him. Said the serpent slept deep here, and as long as the land was respected, it would stay sleeping. But if the country was pushed too hard, used up too much." He trailed off, looking at my drought-stressed pastures where cattle had stripped vegetation down to bare earth in their desperate search for feed. I felt defensive, the criticism implied in his words stinging, despite his gentle tone. "I'm not doing anything different than my father or grandfather did." "Maybe not. But the drought's different, isn't it? Harder than before. And you're pushing harder, because you have to. Tommy's tone remained neutral, but his eyes held understanding of the impossible choices facing station owners in a changing climate. The land feels everything, Jake. Every bore you sink, every tree you clear, every cow that strips grass down to bare dirt, the serpent feels it too. We sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of generations pressing down on the ancient rock shelter. The painted figures seemed to shift slightly in the changing light, their ochre and white pigments catching and reflecting the morning sun. Finally I asked, "What happens now?" Tommy stood, dusting off his jeans with the methodical movements of someone preparing to leave important business unfinished. "That's not up to me. Or you, really. But if I were you, I'd be very careful about what I did near that water. The serpent's not cruel, but it's powerful. And it's protective of the country." That afternoon I stood on my veranda watching Tommy's dust trail disappear toward the horizon. The old stockman had declined offers of lunch, cold drinks, even fuel money, saying he needed to get back to his own responsibilities. But he'd left me with a phone number written on a scrap of paper and a final warning that echoed in my head. Don't try to block that water or redirect it. Don't take samples of it to town for testing. And whatever you do, don't let anyone else mess with those paintings. As evening approached, I noticed my cattle gathering near the house paddock, something they rarely did during the day. Their movement was deliberate but nervous, groups of 20 or 30 head collecting into larger clusters, with the restless energy of animals responding to pressure I couldn't identify. By sunset the entire herd had congregated in the home paddocks, as far from the Rainbow Creek as they could get, while remaining within the fenced boundaries. Their usual evening routine had been completely abandoned, in favor of this mass migration, toward what they apparently considered safer ground. My dogs whined and paced, refusing to settle in their usual spots. Sheila kept returning to the front steps, looking up at me with expressions of anxiety that seemed almost human. Dot circled the house repeatedly, stopping every few minutes to stare in the direction of the impossible water. I walked the fence line as darkness fell, checking gates and water points out of habit more than necessity. My boots crunched on drought-hardened earth that should have been soft with moisture from recent rain. When I reached the bore that supplied my main cattle trough, I found dozens of heads standing around the concrete tank, necks stretched toward the water but not drinking. Their posture was all wrong, heads lowered as if to drink, but bodies held back as if invisible barriers prevented them from approaching the trough. Several animals had foam around their muzzles, indicating they'd been salivating heavily, their bodies demanding water their instincts warned them to avoid. I climbed the fence and approached slowly, not wanting to spook them. The cattle shifted aside as I neared the trough, their eyes reflecting the beam of my flashlight in that distinctive way that indicated high stress. The bore water looked normal, clear and cool, pumped from the same aquifer that had supplied the property for decades. I cupped my hands and tasted it, finding nothing unusual in the mineral-rich flavor I'd grown accustomed to over 15 years. But, when I tried to lead my cattle closer, they balked and retreated, lowing anxiously with voices that spoke of confusion rather than simple thirst. "What's wrong with you lot?" I muttered, but even as I said it, I felt the same inexplicable unease that seemed to be affecting every animal on my property. The familiar taste of bore water now carried undertones I couldn't identify, subtle wrongness that made me want to spit, despite my body's desperate need for hydration. Walking back toward the house, I detoured past the Rainbow Creek. In the darkness, the water seemed to glow with its own light, the colors shifting and flowing in patterns that hurt my eyes to follow directly. The sound of running water, absent from my property for months, now dominated the night soundscape with the musical babble of healthy flow over stone. But it wasn't just the creek anymore. I stopped, listening carefully. The sound of flowing water seemed to come from multiple directions: north toward the main road, south toward my boundary fence, east toward the rocky country where I rarely took cattle. The night air carried the distinct acoustics of water movement, but from sources that shouldn't exist. I pulled out my flashlight and followed the sound northward, finding a second stream that definitely hadn't existed that morning. The water here was just as impossibly colorful, flowing steadily across land that had been cracked clay 12 hours earlier. The new channel cut through areas where I'd walked countless times, carving a path that seemed to follow no logical topography. By the time I'd traced 3 separate waterways, all flowing with the same rainbow-tinted water, I realized that something far beyond my understanding was reshaping my property. The streams seemed to follow no logical topography, flowing uphill in places where gravity should have prevented any movement at all. They carved channels through bedrock that should have taken centuries to erode, leaving behind smooth stone surfaces that looked like they'd been polished by decades of flow. Standing in the middle of what had been my driest paddock, now bisected by a stream that babbled with impossible cheerfulness, I finally understood why my grandfather had marked that single word on his survey map. Whatever was happening here had happened before, and the old man had chosen to respect it rather than fight it. The evidence was carved into the landscape itself, not just in the ancient rock paintings, but in the subtle contours of the land that suggested water had flowed here before, following these same impossible routes. The question now was whether I had the wisdom to make the same choice. I left at first light, driving my battered Toyota through gates. I'd had to relocate twice in the past day, as the water carved new channels across my access roads. The rainbow streams had stabilized overnight, no longer spreading but flowing with steady persistence through what had been bone-dry country. The sound of their movement carried clearly in the still morning air, a musical backdrop that transformed familiar paddocks into something that belonged in a different world entirely. My cattle dogs rode in the back, finally calm now that we were leaving the property, though they kept their ears pinned and eyes fixed on the receding waterways until the homestead disappeared behind the ridgeline. Their relief was palpable, bodies relaxing into normal travel positions as we gained distance from whatever force had been disturbing them. The 2-hour drive to Millfield gave me time to think, but every rational explanation I constructed crumbled against what I'd witnessed. Underground springs didn't appear overnight across hundreds of hectares. Water didn't flow uphill or glow with rainbow colors. Yet I'd measured the flow rates, tested the pH, even followed one stream for 3 kilometers as it wound through country I'd known since childhood, transforming familiar paddocks into something that belonged in a completely different category of reality. At Murphy's Feed and Station Supplies, I found half a dozen other station owners clustered around the coffee machine, their usual morning ritual expanded into an impromptu crisis meeting. The atmosphere was tense, voices carrying the particular strain that came with problems that didn't fit familiar categories. Bill Crawford from Sunset Downs was talking animatedly, gesturing with his coffee cup toward the eastern ranges with movements that spoke of genuine agitation. Never seen anything like it. Dave's got video footage, shows the water just appearing out of nowhere around midnight. His wife swears she saw it glowing from their bedroom window. My grandfather told stories about this, said Mary Kowalski, whose family had run cattle on Ironbark Station for 4 generations. Her voice carried the particular authority that came with deep family knowledge of country. Said it happened in 1923, maybe 24. Nobody believed him then either. I approached the group slowly, unsure how to explain my own situation without sounding completely unhinged. The familiar smell of coffee and diesel fuel provided comforting normalcy, but the tension in the room was unmistakable. Bill noticed me first, his weathered face showing the particular strain that came with sleepless nights spent dealing with inexplicable problems. "Jake, you're just in time. We're comparing notes about this water business. Please tell me you've got some rational explanation, because the rest of us are stumped." "You're seeing it too." I felt a mix of relief and growing concern. If the phenomenon was regional, it was far bigger than I'd imagined. The possibility that I was dealing with isolated craziness disappeared, replaced by the more disturbing prospect of something affecting thousands of square kilometers. Dave Patterson, a quiet man who ran sheep on the margins of viable country, pulled out his phone with the careful movements of someone handling evidence. "Started about 11 last night. Watch this." The video showed a dry creek bed in harsh LED flashlight illumination, familiar reddish earth cracked into polygonal patterns by months of drought. Then a sudden rush of water flowing around the camera position, liquid that caught the light strangely and threw it back in patterns that shifted independently of the current. "Same here," I said quietly. "Multiple streams, all showing up overnight. My cattle won't drink bore water anymore. They'll only go near this new stuff, but they act spooked by it." The admission felt like a confession of failure, an acknowledgement that I'd lost control of basic ranch operations. "That's the part that's got me worried," Mary said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd inherited deep knowledge of country along with her property. Animals know things we don't. My horses are acting like there's a bushfire coming, but they're not running away from anything, they're just alert all the time, watching the water. Bill spread a hand-drawn map across the nearest table, pushing aside coffee cups and supply catalogs to make room. I've been tracking reports since dawn. Phone's been ringing non-stop. His finger traced rough circles on the paper, marking affected properties with the methodical precision of someone trying to impose order on chaos. Best I can figure, we've got new water sources appearing across maybe 2,000 square kilometers. All the same description, colored water, flowing where there's never been permanent streams, animals acting strange. I studied the map, recognizing most of the property names. The affected area formed a rough oval centered on the ancient volcanic country, where my grandfather had first settled. The rock paintings Tommy had shown me were near the heart of it, positioned exactly where the phenomenon seemed strongest. Anyone talk to the Aboriginal communities? I asked. They might have seen this before. The suggestion felt awkward in my mouth, acknowledging expertise that most of us had spent lifetimes ignoring. That old stockman Tommy Bradshaw came by my place this morning, Dave said. Didn't say much, just asked if I'd found any stones arranged in patterns near the water. Seemed like he knew more than he was telling. His tone carried the particular frustration of someone accustomed to straightforward problems with practical solutions. He warned me this might happen. Shia, I admitted, the words feeling like betrayal of some unspoken code that prioritized practical explanations over traditional knowledge. Said something about the rainbow serpent, about not disturbing sacred sites. I thought it was just traditional stories. The group fell quiet, the only sounds coming from the coffee machine cycling through its automatic cleaning routine. These were practical people, accustomed to dealing with drought, flood, fire and market fluctuations through hard work and careful planning. Ancient legends belonged to tourism brochures and cultural centers, not to the daily business of running cattle stations. The silence stretched uncomfortably, as we all confronted the possibility that our rational frameworks might be inadequate for understanding what we were experiencing. Government's sending someone out, Bill said finally, his voice carrying relief at the prospect of official expertise. Hydrologist from the water department, maybe a geologist too, but they won't be here for 3 days, and I've got cattle that need water I can trust. I bought my supplies quickly, extra fuel, tinned food, batteries for my radio, and headed home with more questions than answers. The rainbow streams were clearly part of something much larger, affecting country that had been in European hands for over a century. Yet none of the station owners had seemed aware of the Aboriginal sites scattered through the region, the rock paintings and stone arrangements that Tommy treated with such reverence. The drive back felt different, my perception altered by the morning's conversations. I found myself noticing features of the landscape I'd overlooked for years, rocky outcrops that might shelter ancient art, creek beds that wound through country in patterns that seemed almost intentional, rather than purely geological. My grandfather's map, tucked in my shirt pocket, suddenly felt like a fragment of a much larger story that had been deliberately forgotten. As I crested the final ridge before my homestead, I pulled over and stared. The house sat on its small rise exactly as I'd left it, but everything else had changed dramatically. Rainbow-tinted streams now flowed on 3 sides of the building, effectively turning my home into an island, accessible only by a narrow causeway of higher ground. The water moved with purposeful grace, following contours that transformed my familiar paddocks into something resembling a vast sacred site. But it was what emerged from the previously dry creek beds that made my hand shake on the steering wheel. Stone arrangements, circles, spirals, and linear patterns now rose above the water level, where none had existed before. They looked ancient, weathered by centuries of erosion, yet I was certain they'd been buried under silt and debris until the flowing water exposed them. The patterns were clearly deliberate, too regular and purposeful to be natural formations. I drove carefully down the slope, following the narrow, dry ridge toward my house. The stone patterns became more elaborate as I approached, forming complex designs that seemed to focus on my homestead like spokes of a wheel. Each arrangement was different, some consisting of large boulders placed with obvious intention, others made up of carefully selected smaller stones arranged in precise geometric forms that spoke of mathematical sophistication. Parking beside my house, I walked to the edge of the water surrounding my home. The rainbow streams flowed silently here, their colors more subdued in the afternoon light, but still clearly visible as ribbons of impossible beauty. I knelt and touched the surface, finding it cool and clean, with a faint mineral taste that reminded me of water from deep springs, but carried undertones I couldn't identify. Standing among the emerged stone circles, I finally understood what Tommy had been trying to tell me. This wasn't just about water appearing where it shouldn't. The land itself was revealing layers of meaning and purpose that had been hidden for generations, showing me evidence of custodianship that stretched back thousands of years. My cattle station, my fences, my bore pumps and stock routes, all of it was a temporary overlay on something far more permanent and significant. The sun was setting as I stood on my veranda, surrounded by impossible waters and ancient stones, finally beginning to comprehend the true scope of what was awakening beneath my feet. The familiar sounds of evening, wind through corrugated iron, settling timbers, distant cattle movements, now seemed like whispers from a much more recent layer of history than I'd ever imagined. The sound of vehicles approaching woke me before dawn. From my veranda, I watched dust clouds rising in the distance, not from the main track, but from country that had been impassable yesterday. Somehow the mysterious waterways had created new pathways through terrain that had been broken and difficult for decades. 3 vehicles emerged from the pre-dawn gloom. Tommy's battered Toyota leading 2 newer 4-wheel drives that moved with the careful precision of unfamiliar drivers following an expert guide. As they drew closer, I counted at least 8 people, mostly older Aboriginal men and women I didn't recognize. Their vehicles parked on the Crevor, narrow causeway, leading to my homestead, with the particular care of people who understood they were entering significant country. They climbed out slowly, moving with the deliberate respect I'd seen at funerals and other ceremonial occasions. Tommy stepped forward first, but his usual casual demeanor had been replaced by something approaching formal authority. "Jake," Tommy called, his voice carrying ceremonial weight that made me straighten unconsciously. "These are the elders from the community. Mary Naparola, David Japananka, Samuel Jungarai." He continued with introductions, each name carrying precise pronunciation that spoke of deep respect. "They've driven all night to get here." The eldest woman, Mary, stepped forward with movements that suggested arthritis carefully managed through lifetime experience. Her weathered face held my gaze with quiet authority that needed no explanation or justification. She spoke in her own language first, her words flowing like the strange waters around my home, carrying meanings I couldn't understand, but somehow felt in my chest. Then she switched to English, her accent carrying the distinctive rhythm of someone translating between completely different ways of understanding the world. "This country's been sleeping a long time. Now it's waking up, showing you what was always here." The group moved past my fence line to the edge of the flowing water without waiting for invitation or permission. Without ceremony, they began to arrange themselves in a pattern that seemed to mirror the stone circles the water had revealed. Samuel, a man I guessed to be in his 70s despite his upright bearing, pulled a small canvas bag from his truck and withdrew traditional ochres, red, white, yellow and black pigments that caught the pre-dawn light with the particular richness of materials that had been prepared according to ancient methods. "We need to sing the country awake properly," Tommy explained, his usual casual demeanor completely replaced by ceremonial seriousness. "Help it remember itself." As the sun crested the horizon, painting the landscape in shades of gold and red that echoed the flowing water's impossible colors, the elders began. Their voices rose in harmonies I had never heard before, sounds that seemed to emerge from the earth itself rather than human throats. The singing was complex, layered with rhythms that suggested meaning far beyond simple melody. Mary marked patterns on her face and arms with ochre, her movements precise and practiced, while the men created rhythms with carved sticks and a small drum made from stretched hide that resonated with frequencies I felt in my bones. The singing continued as the light strengthened, and I found myself drawn into something beyond my understanding. The rainbow waters seemed to respond to the voices, their colors deepening and shifting in patterns that matched the cadence of the songs. The stone arrangements appeared sharper, more defined, as if the music was teaching them to remember their original purposes. Even the morning air seemed different, carrying sense of moisture and growing things that shouldn't exist in drought-stressed country. David approached me during a pause between songs, his English careful but clear, each word chosen with the precision of someone translating between worldviews. "This Serpent country, Rainbow Serpent been sleeping underneath your grandfather's time, your father's time, now she's moving, showing you the old agreements." "What agreements?" I asked, my voice rough from the dry air and the emotional intensity of watching something I couldn't fully comprehend but somehow recognized as profoundly important. Between the people and the land, how to live here properly, how to take care, not just take. David gestured toward the waterways, with movements that encompassed not just the visible streams, but the entire transformed landscape. She's asking you going to be proper caretaker, or you going to keep treating country like something you own? The singing resumed, and I watched my cattle in the distant paddocks. They had moved closer to the property boundaries, clustering near the rainbow streams but still refusing to drink. Their behavior had become increasingly erratic, some standing motionless for hours in postures that suggested deep listening, others pacing the fence lines as if seeking escape routes from something they could sense but I couldn't understand. As the ceremony continued into the morning, I felt the weight of decision settling around me like the red dust that perpetually coated everything in this country. The elders weren't asking me to understand their traditions completely. They were asking me to acknowledge that my way of being here was one option among many, and perhaps not the best one. Their presence carried the particular authority that came from relationships with country that stretched back generations, connections that made my 15 years of residence seem like a brief visit. When the singing finally ended, the silence felt profound and expectant. Mary approached me directly, her movements careful but determined. "That water's not going to stay forever," she said, her voice carrying matter-of-fact certainty about predictions I had no way to verify. "When it goes back underground, what you going to do?" Tommy joined the conversation, his familiar face now carrying the weight of cultural responsibility I'd never seen before. "She's right, Jake, this isn't permanent. The Serpent's just showing you what's possible, but she's got her own business to attend to. Question is, what kind of person you want to be when she's gone?" The elders packed their ceremonial items with the same quiet precision they had brought to their songs. Before leaving, each one shook my hand, their touches lingering long enough to convey meanings that words couldn't carry. Mary's handshake lasted longest, her weathered palm pressing against mine with gentle firmness that felt like a blessing and a challenge simultaneously. After they departed, I spent the day walking the boundaries of the transformed landscape, trying to imagine my property without the rainbow waters, without the revealed stone circles, without the sense of ancient purpose that now permeated everything. The reality was stark. My bore water remained muddy and insufficient, my cattle were becoming increasingly stressed, and my bank account wouldn't sustain the operation much longer, even under normal circumstances. That evening, I sat on my veranda, watching the sun set over water that shouldn't exist, surrounded by stone arrangements that spoke of human presence stretching back millennia. The beauty was undeniable, but so was the practical impossibility of my situation. The familiar sounds of evening, wind through grass, settling house timbers, distant cattle movements, now seemed layered with deeper meanings I was only beginning to recognize. As if responding to my thoughts, the water began to change during the night. I woke several times to check, and each time the streams seemed slightly diminished, their rainbow coloration less vivid than it had been at sunset. The musical sound of flowing water was becoming quieter, less dominant in the night soundscape. By dawn, the retreat was obvious, water lines dropping visibly, flow rates decreasing, the impossible becoming merely improbable. By midday, the recession had accelerated dramatically. Stone circles that had been half submerged in flowing water now stood completely exposed, their ancient arrangements clearly visible for the first time in generations. The causeway to my homestead widened as streams that had flowed around my house contracted to narrow channels, then to scattered pools that reflected the harsh afternoon sun like broken mirrors. I watched my cattle closely as the water disappeared. They seemed to sense the change, becoming more agitated rather than less. Several times, groups of steers approached the shrinking pools as if to drink, then backed away with visible distress, their instincts apparently warning them against water their bodies desperately needed. When I checked my water troughs, I discovered what I had dreaded. My bore pump was drawing nothing but air and sediment, producing only dry coughs and mechanical strain. The transformation reversed itself with the same impossible speed it had begun. By sunset, I stood in landscape that looked almost normal, dry creek beds following familiar contours, my familiar paddock boundaries restored to their drought-stressed normalcy. The stone arrangements now appeared to be natural rock outcrops, unless examined closely, their purposeful geometry disguised by shadow, and the eye's tendency to see what it expected. The only evidence of the previous day's impossibility was the complete absence of groundwater from my bore, and the strange behavior of my cattle, who continued to avoid their usual water sources with the persistence of animals who had learnt hard lessons about survival. Standing in my kitchen that evening, I calculated numbers I already knew by heart. Without bore water, I had perhaps a week's worth of tank water for the house, and no reliable source for my stock. The nearest town was too far for daily water runs, and the cost would bankrupt me within a month, even if I could manage the logistics. My cattle were already showing signs of stress from refusing available water sources, and their condition would deteriorate rapidly under the harsh conditions. The rainbow serpent had shown me wonders, had revealed layers of meaning in landscape I'd thought I understood completely, but it had also stripped away my illusions about sustainability and ownership, leaving me face to face with the fundamental precariousness of my position in this ancient, unforgiving country. That night I sat on my veranda under stars that seemed closer than they had ever been, finally understanding that the choice Tommy and the elders had spoken about wasn't really a choice at all. The land had made its position clear: continue as I was and fail, or find an entirely different way of being here. The practical decision was becoming unavoidable, but I found myself strangely calm about it. Something had shifted during the days of impossible water and ancient songs, something that made the prospect of losing my cattle operation feel less like failure and more like transformation. Sleep came unexpectedly, pulling me under despite my racing thoughts about water rights and cattle sales. In my dreams, I found myself standing knee-deep in the rainbow serpent's impossible waters again, but now I could see beneath the surface with clarity that extended far beyond normal vision. Massive coils moved in the depths, scales catching and refracting light into prismatic patterns that hurt to look at directly. The serpent was ancient beyond measure, its body extending far beyond what my dreaming mind could comprehend, threading through underground caverns and aquifers that stretched across the continent in networks of connection I'd never imagined. In the dream, I felt no fear, only a profound sense of recognition that settled into my bones like coming home. The creature's eyes were older than the rock paintings, older than the stories themselves, holding knowledge that predated human presence in this country. When it spoke, the words came not as sound but as knowledge settling directly into my understanding. The waters run where they have always run. You have forgotten how to see them. The serpent's movement beneath the earth created the rhythmic pulse I had felt during the flooding, but now I understood it differently. It wasn't the creature causing the water to flow. It was the water following ancient pathways, channels carved by dreaming as much as by geology. My bore had been tapping into borrowed water, stealing from flows that belonged to deeper systems than I'd ever imagined. The rainbow serpent hadn't taken my water away. It had simply reclaimed what was never mine to begin with. I tried to speak in the dream, to ask questions that might help me understand my situation better, but found myself becoming part of the water instead. I flowed through limestone caves decorated with mineral formations that looked like frozen lightning, past underground rivers that had never seen sunlight, through spaces where the boundary between water and stone and story became meaningless. Somewhere in that flowing, I understood that the land's memory was vast and patient, that the drought and flooding and dreaming were all expressions of the same fundamental truth: everything was connected, and nothing belonged to anyone. I woke before dawn, to the sound of my cattle dogs whimpering. Both animals were pressed against my bedroom door, clearly distressed, their usual morning eagerness replaced by obvious anxiety. I pulled on my boots and followed them outside, where they immediately began circling the house in obvious agitation, sniffing at the ground and occasionally backing away from invisible obstacles. The first skin was draped over my fence post near the gate, translucent and gossamer thin in the pre-dawn light. I approached it carefully, recognizing it as a snake skin but unlike any I'd ever seen in 15 years of outback living. The scales caught the fading starlight and threw it back in rainbow patterns, each segment seeming to contain its own spectrum of color that shifted with viewing angle. The skin was enormous, easily 3 meters of what I could see, with both ends disappearing into the scrubland beyond my fenced yard. Following the trail, I found more skins throughout my property. They were draped over rocks, wound around fence posts, stretched between trees in patterns that seemed almost decorative, like prayer flags made of crystallized light. Each one was massive, far larger than any snake species native to the region, and all bore the same impossible rainbow scaling that seemed to generate its own illumination. The skins were so fresh they still held moisture, still flexible enough to move in the morning breeze with fluid grace that suggested life might not have fully departed. My cattle dogs refused to approach any of the skins directly, but they followed my investigation with intense focus, occasionally whining and looking back toward the house as if suggesting retreat might be the wiser option. Their usual morning confidence had been replaced by the particular alertness I'd seen when predators were nearby, but directed at objects that shouldn't pose any threat to experienced cattle dogs. I counted at least a dozen separate skins, each one suggesting a serpent of impossible size. The mathematical reality was staggering. If these represented actual molted skins, the creatures that had shed them would be larger than saltwater crocodiles, larger than pythons, larger than anything that could realistically survive in this environment without leaving other evidence of their presence. Yet the evidence was undeniable, physical proof of something that transcended normal biological categories. I touched one of the skins, finding it cool and slightly damp, with a texture unlike anything in my experience. It felt simultaneously organic and mineral, like touching crystallized water or fossilized light. When I lifted a section, it weighed almost nothing, but the rainbow patterns shifted and intensified, creating the momentary illusion that something still lived within the transparent membrane. The arrangement of the skins wasn't random. I gradually recognized a pattern that seemed to trace the path the impossible waters had taken during the flooding. The largest concentration surrounded the stone circles that had emerged from the creek beds, while others marked the boundaries of where the water had reached its highest extent. It was as if the rainbow serpent had left a map of its presence, marking the territory it had claimed, and then released with the precision of someone establishing clear boundaries. By the time Tommy's truck appeared on the horizon, I had documented the locations of every skin I could find. The old stockman brought tea in a thermos and seemed unsurprised by my discoveries, his calm acceptance providing steady comfort in a morning that had already challenged every assumption I'd held about the normal operation of the natural world. "They'll be gone by noon," Tommy said, settling onto the veranda steps and studying the nearest skin, which hung from my windmill like a translucent banner. His tone carried the matter-of-fact certainty of someone describing familiar weather patterns. "Where do they come from?" I asked, accepting the offered cup of tea and trying to process the casual way Tommy discussed the impossible. Tommy was quiet for a long moment, watching the sunrise paint the skins in even more vivid colors. When he spoke, his words came slowly, chosen with the care of someone translating between worldviews that operated according to completely different rules. Same place the water came from, same place the stories come from, place that's always been here, just usually we can't see it. I waited, understanding by now that Tommy's explanations came at their own pace and couldn't be hurried. "Rainbow serpent doesn't really shed skin like regular snakes," Tommy continued, his gaze fixed on the translucent membrane fluttering in the morning breeze. "These are more like messages. Proof that the dreaming touched this place. Your bore didn't just run dry, Jake. It got disconnected from the real water system. Been drawing from the wrong source. What's the right source?" Tommy gestured broadly at the landscape around us, his movements encompassing not just the visible features but something larger and more complex. "Country itself. But you gotta have the right relationship with country first. Can't just drill a hole and take what you need. Gotta ask permission. Gotta give something back." I considered this while watching my cattle in the distance. They were still agitated, still refusing to drink from the emergency water I'd trucked in from town at considerable expense. The elders mentioned a choice. What exactly am I choosing between? Not between two things, Tommy said, his weathered hands wrapped around his teacup with careful attention to its warmth. More like choosing which way you want to belong here. You've been trying to own this place, make it work for you. But that's backwards. Country doesn't belong to people. People belong to country. The morning sun was strengthening, and I could see that Tommy was right about the skins. They were becoming more translucent, their rainbow patterns fading as the dew evaporated. Within an hour, they would be gone entirely, leaving behind only the memory of their impossible presence. "The cattle operation is finished either way," I said, stating what we both knew. The admission felt like releasing a breath I'd been holding for months, acknowledging reality that had become unavoidable. Maybe. Or maybe it changes into something else. Depends on whether you're willing to learn a different way of being here. Tommy stood and walked to where one of the largest skins was draped over a fence post. As I watched, the old man placed his weathered palm against the translucent membrane and spoke softly in language I didn't recognize, but somehow understood at a level deeper than words. The skin seemed to shimmer more brightly for a moment before beginning to dissolve entirely, leaving only a faint outline of moisture on the wooden post. "Country's been teaching you," Tommy said, returning to the veranda with movements that carried ceremonial weight. "Question is whether you're ready to be a student, instead of trying to be the boss." I looked out at my property, the dry creek beds that had briefly run with impossible water, the stone circles that held meanings I was only beginning to glimpse, the cattle that sensed changes I couldn't yet fully understand. The rainbow skins were disappearing as Tommy had predicted, but their message was clear. The old ways of relating to this land were ending. What came next would require a completely different approach, one that honored the deeper intelligence of country itself rather than trying to impose human will upon it. The decision, when it finally came, felt less like a choice than like an inevitable conclusion to a conversation that had been happening beneath my awareness for weeks. I spent 3 days after Tommy's visit walking my property boundaries, seeing the land with eyes that were learning to look differently. The stone circles that had emerged during the flooding weren't random. They formed a pattern that suggested movement, connection, the flow of something much larger than water through the landscape. On the 4th morning, I drove to town and placed a call to the livestock agent in Alice Springs. The conversation was brief and businesslike, numbers and logistics that reduced 20 years of work to market calculations. Market prices were down anyway, and my herd, though healthy, wouldn't fetch what I'd hoped. It didn't matter. The numbers that had once kept me awake at night, mortgage payments, feed costs, diesel prices, suddenly seemed abstract, irrelevant to the larger equation I was now trying to solve. The call to my bank manager was harder. 20 years of working this country, of building something from nothing, reduced to a formal request to discuss alternative land use options and the possibility of restructuring debt around a completely different model. But when I mentioned conservation easements and cultural heritage partnerships, the manager's tone shifted from skepticism to cautious interest. There were government programs, tax incentives, ways to make protection as economically viable as exploitation. Tommy arrived the next afternoon with 3 women from the community, 2 elders, and a younger woman who introduced herself as Sarah, a cultural preservation officer with the Regional Land Council. They spread maps on my kitchen table, maps that showed my property within a much larger context of sacred sites, traditional travel routes, and ecological corridors that connected my land to country, stretching hundreds of kilometers in every direction. "Your place sits right in the middle of an important story," Sarah explained, tracing lines between marked locations with the precise movements of someone who understood the deep significance of what she was showing me. "The Rainbow Serpent's track runs through here, connects waterholes and ceremony sites from the Tanami to the McDonald's. Been broken up by stations and mining leases for over a century, but if we could establish this as protected country." I studied the maps, seeing my familiar paddocks and fence lines embedded within something vast and ancient and purposeful. The creek system where my cattle had first refused to cross was marked as a significant site, connected by dotted lines to places I'd never heard of but that clearly held deep importance for the traditional owners. What would it look like practically? I asked, trying to imagine a completely different relationship with land I'd thought I understood. "I mean, I still need to make a living." "Cultural tourism," said one of the elders, a woman named Ruth whose English carried the rhythm of language far older. "Lot of people want to understand country properly. Want to learn the real stories, but they need someone who can talk to both sides, black fella way and white fella way." The negotiations took months. Selling the cattle was the easy part. They went to a station manager in Queensland who understood about drought cycles and the need for quick decisions. Converting the infrastructure was more complex. The shearing shed became a visitor center, its corrugated iron walls insulated and fitted with displays that told the story of country in both traditional and contemporary terms. The cattle yards were dismantled, and their materials used to build outdoor classroom spaces and camping facilities, designed to leave minimal impact on the landscape. I found myself learning alongside the contractors and consultants who descended on the property. Traditional owners taught me to read the subtle signs that indicated sacred areas to be left completely undisturbed, while tourism operators showed me how to construct walking trails that would give visitors meaningful access to the stories held in the landscape without damaging the places that contained them. The hardest part was learning to speak about the land in ways that honored both its practical and spiritual dimensions. I had always been comfortable with rainfall statistics and soil pH levels, but now I needed to understand the cultural protocols around sharing Dreamtime stories, The appropriate ways to acknowledge traditional ownership while explaining my own role as a partner rather than proprietor. Sarah proved invaluable during this transition, helping me navigate the complex relationships between different family groups who held knowledge about various parts of the property. She taught me that my earlier assumption, that the land belonged to whoever held legal title, was not just wrong but backwards. The real relationships were between specific people and specific places, connections that had been maintained across generations, despite the colonial disruption of formal ownership structures. By late spring, 12 months after the rainbow serpent had first risen in the normally dry creek beds, the cultural conservation area was ready for its first visitors. I stood in what had once been my machinery shed, now converted into an interpretation center, displaying traditional artifacts alongside contemporary satellite imagery that showed the property's position within larger ecological systems. The morning's group included a family from Germany, 2 archaeology students from Adelaide, and a retired couple from Perth who'd been following Aboriginal art trails across the territory. I watched Tommy lead them toward the creek where it had all begun, speaking in his unhurried way about country and connection, about the difference between land as commodity and land as relationship. My role was different but equally important. I talked about the transition from cattle station to conservation area, about what I'd learned regarding the false separation between economic and ecological value. The visitors were fascinated by my story of the mysterious flooding, though I was careful to describe it in terms that respected the cultural sensitivities around sacred knowledge. What surprised me most was how naturally I'd adapted to this new identity. Instead of waking before dawn to check water troughs and count cattle, I spent early mornings walking the property boundaries with Tommy and other traditional owners, learning to recognize the subtle seasonal changes that indicated the health of country itself. Rather than worrying about beef prices and rainfall statistics, I found myself thinking about the long-term patterns that connected my small patch of territory to the vast cycles that governed the continent. The financial arrangements worked better than anyone had expected. Government grants covered the infrastructure conversion costs, while visitor fees and cultural program revenues provided sustainable ongoing income. My partnership with the Land Council meant that profits supported both my modest living requirements and broader cultural preservation initiatives across the region. More importantly, I discovered a satisfaction I'd never found in the relentless mathematics of cattle production. Each group of visitors who left with deeper understanding of country's complexity felt like a small victory, a contribution to something larger than individual survival. The land itself seemed to respond positively to this changed relationship, with native vegetation recovering in areas that had been overgrazed, and bird species returning to creek systems that had been dry for decades. Standing in the interpretation center at day's end, I reflected on the completeness of my transformation. The man who'd once measured success in terms of livestock numbers and property values now found meaning in the gradual repair of relationships between traditional and contemporary knowledge systems, between human communities and the landscapes that sustained them, between the immediate requirements of economic survival and the longer-term needs of cultural and ecological continuity. Through the window, I could see the creek bed, where rainbow-colored water had once flowed impossibly across my drought-stricken property. It was dry again now, waiting for the seasonal rains that would bring more conventional flooding. But I understood that the real transformation hadn't been in the water, or the mysterious snakeskins that had appeared and vanished. The change had been in my own capacity to recognize that belonging to country meant accepting responsibility for its well-being, rather than simply extracting value from its resources. The afternoon light filtered through the red gums as I watched the latest group of visitors gather near the creek bed where it had all begun. A family from Adelaide crouched beside their teenage daughter, examining the ancient rock paintings that Tommy was explaining, with patient gestures and movements that conveyed respect for knowledge held in the stone itself. 2 backpackers from Germany scribbled notes in weathered journals, while a retired couple from Perth asked careful questions about the traditional seasonal calendar that governed water flows and wildlife movements. "This is where the rainbow serpent's path crosses the ancestral boundaries," Tommy was saying, his weathered hand tracing the painted curves on the sandstone surface without quite touching the ancient pigments. When the old people painted this, they weren't just making pictures, they were recording the law, the way country works, the connections between all living things. I remained at a respectful distance, knowing my role was to provide context for visitors who struggled to understand the depth of what they were experiencing. Too many people arrived expecting simple tourist attractions, easy stories that could be photographed and posted, then forgotten during the drive back to air-conditioned hotels. The challenge was helping them recognize that they were encountering something that demanded more than casual consumption. The German backpackers approached me with expressions of earnest confusion that I'd learned to recognize. "Excuse me," the young woman said, "but we're having trouble understanding how the water phenomenon you described actually happened. Was it some kind of underground spring system? Climate change effects? There must be a scientific explanation." I had fielded similar questions hundreds of times, and my response had evolved through trial and error. Early on, I'd made the mistake of trying to rationalize the experience, offering half-formed theories about artesian pressure and unusual rainfall patterns. But those explanations satisfied no one and missed the point entirely. "The question isn't really how it happened," I said now, watching their faces carefully for signs of understanding. "The question is what it meant, and what we were supposed to learn from it. Some experiences can't be reduced to mechanisms we already understand. Sometimes the meaning is in accepting that there are forces in the landscape that operate according to different rules than the ones we're used to." The young man frowned, his need for rational categories clearly frustrated by my response. "But surely you must have theories. Underground water systems, geological pressure, electromagnetic phenomena." "I've got theories," I admitted, recognizing the particular frustration that came with experiences that didn't fit familiar frameworks. But chasing after explanations that fit our existing categories would mean missing what the land was actually trying to communicate. The rainbow serpent isn't a metaphor for hydrological processes. It's a way of understanding the deeper intelligence that connects water and land and life, in patterns too complex for our usual measurements. He gestured toward the creek bed, trying to impose rational order on something that transcended normal categories. What happened here changed everything about how I related to this country. If I'd spent that time trying to prove it fit some scientific model, I would have missed the opportunity to learn what it was actually teaching. The afternoon progressed through its familiar rhythms, each conversation requiring me to translate between worldviews. I guided the group along the walking trails, pointing out the recovery of native vegetation in areas where cattle had once overgrazed. I explained the seasonal indicators that traditional owners used to predict weather patterns and wildlife movements, the subtle signs that spoke of country's health or stress. At each stop, visitors asked questions that revealed their assumptions about the relationship between human communities and natural systems. The family from Adelaide wanted to know about economic sustainability, their concerns reflecting the practical realities that most people faced when considering alternative lifestyles. The retired couple inquired about government regulations, trying to understand how cultural preservation operated within existing legal frameworks. The backpackers pressed for more details about the supernatural elements of the story, their European perspective struggling to accommodate experiences that didn't fit rational categories. Each conversation required careful navigation, finding language that could bridge the gap between contemporary expectations and traditional knowledge systems without diminishing either perspective. As the group prepared to depart, the teenage daughter lingered near the rock paintings. "Do you think it will happen again?" she asked, her voice carrying the particular seriousness that young people sometimes brought to conversations about meaning and mystery. "The water coming back? The rainbow serpent rising?" I considered the question seriously, remembering the months since the transformation of my operation. The physical phenomena had been dramatic but brief. The snake skins had disappeared, the impossible waterways had receded, the mysterious rainbow colors had faded from the creek beds. To outside observers, the land looked much as it had before the extraordinary season began. "I think it's always happening," I said finally, the words carrying understanding that had developed slowly over months of learning to see country differently. Not the dramatic stuff, the colored water, and the overnight rivers, but the deeper process, the land teaching us how to listen, how to belong properly to country. Most of the time we're too busy to notice. Sometimes it takes something impossible to get our attention. The girl nodded with the gravity that young people sometimes brought to conversations that adults had forgotten how to take seriously. Her parents called from the vehicle, cameras and water bottles packed away, ready for the drive back to familiar surroundings, where impossible water and ancient paintings belonged to tourism experiences rather than daily reality. After the group departed, I walked slowly back toward the homestead, following paths that had become as familiar as the cattle runs I'd once traveled daily. The landscape held different significance now, not a resource to be managed and exploited, but a complex system of relationships in which I played a small but meaningful part. The evening light caught the surfaces of the rock paintings, bringing out colors and details that weren't visible during the harsh brightness of midday. I paused beside the images that had started my education in seeing country through traditional eyes. The painted serpent forms seemed to shift slightly in the changing light, reminding me that the stories they represented weren't historical artifacts, but living knowledge that continued to guide proper relationships between people and place. I thought about the questions visitors asked, their need for rational explanations and measurable outcomes. There had been a time when I'd shared those priorities, when the value of land could be calculated in terms of carrying capacity and market prices. The transformation hadn't eliminated my appreciation for practical considerations. The cultural center operated according to budgets and visitor numbers and maintenance schedules. But those practical elements now served larger purposes than individual profit. Standing in the gathering dusk, I reflected on the completeness of the lesson I'd received. The rainbow serpent had risen not just from the creek beds, but from my own willingness to accept that belonging to country meant something more complex than legal ownership or economic control. The mysterious water had receded, but the understanding it brought continued to flow through every aspect of my daily existence. The first stars appeared in the darkening sky, marking the beginning of another night in the cycles that governed this ancient landscape. I knew that tomorrow would bring new groups of visitors, new opportunities to share what the land had taught me about the proper relationship between human communities and the places that sustained them. Some would leave with deeper understanding. Others would remain puzzled by experiences that didn't fit their existing categories of knowledge. But that was part of the ongoing work, the patient translation between worldviews, the gradual repair of relationships that had been damaged by generations of misunderstanding about what it meant to care for country. The rainbow serpent might not rise again in the dramatic form I'd witnessed, but its deeper teachings continued to move through the landscape, waiting for people ready to listen to what the land itself was trying to say. If you've ever stood on country that holds stories older than memory, you know the feeling of being small in the face of something vast and patient. Hit like and subscribe. There are more stories from the heart of Australia coming your way.